He thought he'd lost everything, his past, filled with silence, his future empty. Then, in the wild spring of Montana, he saw her, a woman no one wanted, standing alone in the dust. Neither of them looking for love, just a way to survive. Together, they faced harsh winters, loneliness, and loss, building more than a home, building a family from broken pieces. This is the story of two lost souls who found a place to belong. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments below, and if stories like this touch your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more. Now lean in and let the journey begin. I still remember the wind that morning, how it scraped the land raw and carried the scent of pine mixed with dust. I hadn't come looking for a wife. In truth, I hadn't come looking for anything more than lumber and seed. Yet there she stood beside the chapel, her dress worn and eyes older than her years, like she had already lived and buried 1,000 lifetimes. That spring of 1873 in Montana was sharp enough to cut through bone. My horse's breath steamed in the morning air as I tied him to the hitching post outside Clearwater's single-leaning church house. I felt the eyes of the town on my back. Whispers traveled faster than wind out there. They had already weighed and measured her, found her lacking a woman, left at the altar, kin buried last winter, pockets empty, heart presumed emptier still. She didn't turn when I stepped inside, but I saw her hands folded too tightly in her lap, knuckles white under skin pale as bleached cloth. Something in me, long buried under years of silence and disappointment, shifted at that sight. Maybe it was the quiet defiance in the way she held her head. Maybe it was because I too had known what it meant to be left standing in the ruin of someone else's promises. I asked the preacher for a marriage license. His eyes flicked from me to her and back again, his silence thick as church walls. She didn't look at me until after the ink had dried. Her gaze was neither thankful nor frightened, just waiting, as though she had stopped expecting kindness a long time ago. We left Clearwater that afternoon without celebration. No supper, no song, just a wagon half loaded with seed and tin, and two souls who had yet to speak more than a handful of words to each other. The road north was mud and rock, the wind cold enough to numb the skin, and the silence between us settled like a third traveler on the bench. My homestead lay 30 miles out, tucked between a line of cottonwoods and the slow bend of a creek. The cabin was little more than hewn logs and stubborn hope, but it stood solid against the mountain gusts. I told her she could have the bed. I'd take the cot by the hearth. She didn't argue, though her eyes lingered on me as if to ask why a man who had no reason to care might still try to keep her warm. In those first weeks, words between us were scarce as sunlight in winter. The snow melted to reveal the bruises in the earth, and mud stained everything we touched. I planted barley and oats, repaired the corral, patched the roof. She moved through the days with a kind of quiet determination, mending shirts, splitting kindling, tending a garden that had yet to take root. Nights came cold and long. Sometimes, when the wind rattled loose boards and whistled through the cracks, I'd find her sitting near the fire, arms wrapped around her knees. She never spoke of what haunted her, and I didn't force her to. I'd sit on the other side of the hearth, each of us wrapped in our own silences, until the coals burned low and the fear lost its edge. The land did not forgive weakness. It asked for everything and returned little, save for what a man and woman might build with calloused hands and stubborn hearts. Yet slowly, as the thaw came and the creek rose with melted snow, something softer began to root itself between us, not love, not yet, but an understanding that perhaps neither of us had to remain alone. It was late in the thaw when she ran down the path breathless, skirts muddy to the knee, saying she had seen movement near the barn. Two children, thin as fence posts, and eyes dark with hunger and soot. The older boy barely spoke above a whisper. The girl clung to him, shaking. Their parents, they said, had burned in the cabin south of our land. I felt her beside me, still and waiting for my answer. And though the words tasted strange in my mouth, I said they could stay. That night, they ate beside us at the rough-hewn table. She watched them with a softness I had not yet seen. And when the little girl laid her head against his shoulder, something deep and unspoken passed between them. In the weeks that followed, the boy Ryland followed me through the fields, asking about seed and plowshare. The girl Ruthie clung to her, small hands always reaching for comfort. The cabin, once echoing with emptiness, now hummed with the quiet sounds of living, water boiling, feet across the floor, the scrape of wood against stone. Spring became summer. I built an addition to the cabin, and she made clothes from old flour sacks, her fingers moving with careful grace. Sometimes I'd catch her humming, melodies half remembered, carried from a past life she never spoke of. I didn't ask, it felt enough to listen. And though love did not come all at once, like thunder rolling across the plains, it crept in quietly. In the way she paused to watch me work, in the warmth of her shoulder brushing mine at dusk, in the tired smiles we shared at the end of long days. One evening, as the sun burned the sky copper and gold, she stood beside me at the fence line, hands resting on the rails. Without turning, she said she had not thought she would ever belong anywhere. I found my own voice then, low and uncertain, and told her that perhaps we were both meant to belong to this place and to each other. She did not answer with words. Instead, she stayed beside me until the last of the light died behind the hills, her presence quiet and steady as the land itself. That night, under a roof we had built together, I lay awake listening to her breathing. And for the first time in years, I did not feel like a man only surviving the world's hardness, but a man who had, against every expectation, begun to build something worth keeping. The days lengthened into summer, and with each dawn, the cabin felt a little less like a shelter against the world and a little more like something alive, shaped by our hands and hopes. I woke each morning before first light, the air sharp against my skin, and walked the fence line to check for breaks. Sometimes, when I'd turn back toward the house, I'd see her silhouette in the doorway, hair loose around her shoulders, the children still sleeping behind her. In those quiet mornings, something old in me softened. The land was still hard, the work endless, but it no longer felt like I was fighting against it alone. Her presence turned the struggle into something shared, and shared burdens have a way of feeling lighter. Ryland took to following me like a shadow, watching each movement of my hands as I mended harness or split rails. He rarely spoke at first, eyes wary, words weighed before they left his tongue. But over time, he began to ask questions about why we planted barley instead of wheat, why the soil turned the river brown after rain, why some nails bent no matter how carefully you set them. I answered as best I could, though I had no fine schooling, only what my own hands and years had taught me. And each answer seemed to earn me a little more trust, a little more of the boy's quiet loyalty. Ruthie, on the other hand, clung to Rosalind's skirts as if afraid the world might swallow her if she let go. In the heat of midday, I'd see them by the garden, Rosalind on her knees pulling weeds, Ruthie beside her, small hands clumsy in the soil. And sometimes, when the wind died and the sun hung heavy overhead, Rosalind would pause, wipe sweat from her brow, and trace the shape of Ruthie's cheek with the back of her fingers. It was a gesture so gentle it hurt to watch, as if both were afraid the other might vanish if they stopped touching. The work never let up. Summer demanded sweat and muscle, patching the roof again where spring rains had found new ways to seep through, hauling stone from the creek to shore up the foundation, cutting enough firewood to last through the next winter. My hands split and bled, the scars darkening like old memories. But each night, as the sky turned from red to indigo and the stars pricked through the darkness, I'd see Rosalind move about the cabin mending, stirring the pot over the fire, brushing Ruthie's hair by lantern light, and the ache in my body felt worth it. Some nights, after the children had fallen asleep on their pallets, she and I would sit on the stoop, the boards warm from the day's heat, and watch the fireflies blink between the cottonwoods. Neither of us spoke much. Words had never come easily to either of us, but the silence wasn't empty. It felt full, heavy with everything we chose not to say. One evening, the sky bruised purple with an oncoming storm. She told me in a quiet voice about the man who had left her standing in a borrowed dress beside an empty altar. She spoke without bitterness, as if recounting someone else's story, but her fingers twisted in the folds of her skirt. I didn't know what to say, so I simply listened. And maybe that was enough, because when she finished, she let her hand rest near mine on the rough wood of the step, close enough that our knuckles brushed. Days grew longer, then slowly began to shorten again, the light stretching thin and gold over the hills. The barley ripened in the fields, heavy heads bowing under their own weight. Ryland learned to swing a sickle alongside me, his small hands blistering but never complaining. Ruthie carried water in a dented tin pail, spilling half of it along the path, her brow furrowed in determination. And Rosalind moved through it all, steady as sunrise. She learned to patch harness leather, to set snares near the creek, to mend clothes so well you could barely see where the tear had been. Yet more than that, she gave the place a softness it had never known. The smell of bread baking at dawn, a quilt draped over the backs of chairs, wildflowers in a chipped mug on the table. I caught myself watching her sometimes, the tilt of her head as she listened to Ruthie's babble, the curve of her back as she lifted the kettle from the hearth. And each time, something tightened in my chest, a feeling both foreign and familiar, like remembering a song I hadn't heard since childhood. One morning, as we gathered the barley into bundles, sweat running down our faces, Rosalind paused and looked across the field, her gaze soft. She said she had never thought she'd see a harvest of her own. I wiped my brow and said nothing, but the words stayed with me the rest of the day, echoing in the quiet spaces of my mind. Summer faded into early autumn. The first frost came thin and tentative, melting by midday, but it carried a promise of the harder cold to come. We worked faster, hauling in the last of the squash, digging the root cellar deeper, stacking wood until the lean-to bulged at its seams. One afternoon, a traveling trader stopped by, a man with a crooked hat and a wagon that rattled under the weight of pots, bolts of cloth, and iron nails. Rosalind traded a jar of preserved peaches for a length of faded blue ribbon. That night, she tied it in her hair, and when she turned her head toward the lamplight, it glowed like river water at dusk. I didn't say anything, words felt clumsy for what pressed against my ribs, but she caught my gaze and smiled, a small, careful smile that reached all the way to her eyes. The children grew bolder as the weeks passed. Ryland began to ask if he could try his hand at setting fence posts. Ruthie would wander to the edge of the yard, turning back only when Rosalind called her name. Watching them, I felt something hard in me begin to ease, as if the years of silence and solitude were slowly being worn smooth by the presence of these small, determined lives. As the leaves turned, we found our rhythms. In the mornings, I'd lead the oxen to the creek, while Rosalind stirred the pot over the hearth, the children still blinking sleep from their eyes. Midday brought work, patching, hauling, digging. Evenings meant simple meals, beans and cornbread, sometimes a bit of salt pork if we'd traded well, and the quiet warmth of bodies gathered near the fire. One night, while the wind rattled the shutters, I lay awake on the cot, the fire's glow painting shadows on the ceiling. I listened to the soft murmur of Rosalind's breathing, the children's quieter sighs, and for the first time, I realized the silence that had haunted me for so long had been replaced by something gentler. It wasn't that the world had grown softer, the land was still as unforgiving as ever, the winter still promised to test us. But in that small cabin, in the rustle of blankets and the creak of floorboards, there was a belonging I hadn't known I was searching for. I had taken in a woman no one else wanted, and she had brought with her 2 children who had nothing. Yet together, in the harsh quiet of Montana, we had begun to build something that might just last. Not because of any grand plan or promise, but because each of us, in our own battered way, had chosen to stay. And in choosing to stay, we had begun to find not only survival, but the faint, stubborn roots of something more enduring. When the frost finally thickened on the grass and the morning air bit at our lungs, I rose early to check the roof. As I stepped outside, breath clouding in the dawn, I looked back at the cabin, smoke curling from the chimney, light spilling warm through the window. And standing there, boots damp with dew, I realized that though the road behind me was littered with loss, the path ahead felt different. Because now, for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking it alone. The first real snow came early that year, thick flakes that settled heavy on the cabin roof and softened every sharp edge of the land. I remember standing at the threshold that morning, boots half buried in white, and for a moment it felt as though the whole world had gone silent except for the soft rasp of my own breath. Inside, the stove glowed with a steady orange heat. Rosalind moved quietly through the narrow room, tucking wool blankets tighter around Ruthie, whose small hands clutched the rag-stuffed doll Rosalind had made from scraps of cloth and corn husk. Ryland sat near the hearth, boots steaming as the snow melted from the seams. His gaze followed every movement I made, not out of fear anymore, but as though learning what a man does when the world turns cold. In those first days of winter, time seemed to slow. The days were short, the nights long, and the wind scraped across the walls with a voice that sounded almost human in the darkness. Yet, for all the harshness of the season, there was a kind of closeness in it too, a drawing in around the fire, shoulders brushing in the narrow space, the shared rhythm of breath and heartbeat. Morning started before dawn. I'd wake to the faint rustle of Rosalind rising from the bed, the floorboards creaking under her bare feet. I'd dress by the light of the dying embers, tugging on stiff boots and a coat that smelled faintly of wood smoke and earth. Outside, the snow would crunch underfoot as I crossed to the lean-to to check the woodpile. Frost clung to the timbers like a second skin, and each breath burned my lungs before drifting upward, vanishing into the pale dawn. Ryland insisted on coming with me most mornings, despite the cold that turned his cheeks red and raw. At first, I told him to stay inside, but he kept rising from his pallet before I could leave, and in the end, I stopped arguing. Side by side, we hauled logs from the pile to the cabin, our breath mingling in small white clouds. He never complained, though I knew the weight of the wood bit into his narrow shoulders. There was a stubbornness in him that felt achingly familiar, a silent vow that if I could endure, so could he. Ruthie was too small to help with the heavy work, but she made herself useful in ways only a child can, fetching kindling, handing Rosalind needles and thread, humming soft, tuneless songs as she pressed her cheek to Rosalind's hip. In those moments, something old and brittle inside me seemed to warm, like ice cracking under morning sun. Rosalind herself never stopped moving. In daylight, she mended and sewed, patched the children's clothes until the patches had patches of their own. She boiled lye soap, stirred stews thick with dried beans and strips of salted pork, swept snow from the threshold before it could crust into ice. Even in stillness, she was in motion, the gentle rocking of her foot as she worked the treadle of the sewing machine, the slow rise and fall of her breath as she listened to the wind scratch at the window panes. Sometimes, when the day's work was done and the cabin had grown quiet, I would catch her staring into the flames, eyes distant, her hands gone still in her lap. I never asked what she saw there in the fire, ghosts of a life left behind, perhaps, or the shapes of a life yet to come. All I knew was that when her gaze returned to the room, it always seemed to find me, and in that silent exchange, something passed between us that words could never hold. As weeks passed, the rhythm of winter settled over us, work, warmth, and waiting. We watched the snow deepen around the cabin, listened to the beams creak under the weight of drifts, counted each log burned in the stove as both comfort and cost. Yet the cold did more than test our bodies. It taught us about each other in ways no gentle season ever could. I learned the sound of Rosalind's laughter, not loud, but low and sudden, like water over stone, usually brought forth by Ruthie's clumsy jokes or Ryland's dry, unexpected humor. I learned the crease that formed between her brows when she worried, and how it smoothed when I brushed her hand with mine. I also learned the shape of my own fear, a quiet dread that the winter might prove too long, the food too little, the warmth not enough. But each day that dawned, and each night we survived, wore those fears down, like water wearing grooves into rock. The children grew, even in the deep cold. Ryland's shoulders widened from work, and Ruthie's hair lengthened into a soft, tangled braid Rosalind brushed each morning by the fire. They spoke more freely now, laughter and small quarrels filling the space that had once felt too large, too silent. The cabin became theirs as much as ours, a place of belonging, not just shelter. One particularly cold evening, the wind shrieking across the hills, I found myself sitting at the table long after the others had gone to bed. A single candle burned low, wax dripping onto the scarred wood. My hands lay open before me, palms nicked and calloused, and for the first time, I allowed myself to truly see what we had made. We had come together not out of love, but out of need, a man and a woman, each half empty, each carrying scars and regrets as real as the marks on my skin. Yet in the quiet days and harsher nights, something deeper had taken root. Not passion that burns hot and fast, but a slow, enduring warmth, steady as the hearth that kept us alive. Winter taught me that love is not a thing you find all at once, but something you build piece by piece, moment by moment, until one day you look around and realize it holds you as surely. As the darkest days passed, small signs of change began to appear. Ice along the creek thinned to slush under midday sun. Birds returned, their call sharp and hopeful against the still cold air. One morning, Ruthie ran to the window, pointing at the first pale green shoots that dared to push through the thawing earth beside the cabin. And with the coming of spring came plans, repairing the roof, planting barley and squash, perhaps adding another room to the cabin so Ryland would no longer sleep by the hearth. The land itself seemed to breathe again, and in that breath, we found our own hope rekindled. I remember standing by the creek one dawn, watching the water run free after months of ice. Rosalind joined me, her hand slipping into mine without a word. The sun caught her hair, now tangled by sleep, and for a moment I saw not the woman left at the altar, not the stranger I'd once claimed out of loneliness, but simply her, the woman who had stayed, who had chosen to share this hard, quiet life. I wanted to speak, to say something of what burned behind my ribs, but the words felt too small. Instead, I squeezed her hand, and in her answering grip, I felt all the things neither of us had yet learned to say aloud. Spring, when it came in full, felt like waking from a long shared dream. We planted, we built, we mended. Ryland learned to drive fence posts true and deep, his hands blistered but steady. Ruthie scattered seeds in the garden, her laughter bright as the new grass. And Rosalind moved among us, her presence as quiet and necessary as breath. At night, when the day's work left us bone-tired, we would gather by the hearth. Sometimes she would hum old tunes, sound low and soothing, and I would close my eyes, letting it wrap around the four of us like another layer of warmth. We had started as strangers, bound only by loss and the cold necessity of survival. But through winter's trials, we had become something more. Not yet a family in name, perhaps, but in every way that mattered. And in the hush of those evenings, when the wind had gentled and the fire burned low, I found myself daring to imagine something I had not let myself picture in years. A future not shaped by what I had lost, but by what we had chosen to build together. Spring settled over the valley, slow and deliberate, like a cautious guest, unsure of its welcome. The last patches of snow clung stubbornly to the north-facing slopes, but day by day the ground softened underfoot, and the scent of thawed earth carried on every breeze. I remember the first real warm rain, a soft, steady drizzle that turned the yard to mud and drew the scent of pine from the hillsides. I stood in it a while, letting the water run cold down my neck, until Rosalind's voice called me back inside, and I realized how long I had been staring at nothing. There was work enough to keep our hands from idle thought. We dug the garden rows anew, turning dark soil that steamed in the morning chill. Ryland, taller than before winter set in, set his shoulders to the shovel beside me, his breath quick and even. Ruthie followed behind, scattering seeds with a careless joy only a child can muster, her laughter startling the crows from the fence posts. And Rosalind, ever steady, moved among us like a quiet current guiding Ruthie's small hands, steadying Ryland's grip, when the weight grew too much, glancing my way now and then as though to be sure I still stood with him. That spring, I saw the land with new eyes. What had seemed only hardship when I first cleared the trees now looked like promise. Rows of barley and beans where once there had been only scrub and rock, the beginnings of an orchard marked by saplings no taller than Ruthie. I traced the new fence line with my palm, feeling the rough grain of each post we had sunk together, and thought not for the first time that building something with your own hands changes the way you see the earth beneath your boots. Days lengthened, and with them, so did our hopes. At night, I lay awake and listened to the steady breathing around me, Rosalind beside me in the bed, Ryland and Ruthie in their cots across the single room, and felt a quiet contentment I had not known I was missing. It was not happiness in the loud, fleeting sense I remembered from youth, but something deeper, rooted in shared labor and the fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might bring more than survival. And yet, not every moment was gentle. The thaw brought sickness to the livestock. One of the cows dropped her calf too early, and another came down with a fever we could not break. I spent long nights in the barn, the lantern throwing shadows that moved like living things, pressing my hand to damp, heaving flanks, whispering soft, useless reassurances. Ryland sat with me more often than not, his gaze fixed and solemn, learning the hard truth that sometimes care and hope are not enough. Rosalind worried over me in those days, though she spoke little of it. I saw it in the lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her hands paused over the wash of the mending whenever I returned late from the barn. And when the worst had passed, when the fever broke, or the calf was buried under a cairn of river stone, she would lay a hand on my arm, her touch saying all the things words could not hold. It was in such small moments, I think, that love grew between us, not in grand declarations or sudden passion, but in quiet gestures. A hand on a shoulder, a bowl of stew kept warm by the fire, the way her gaze steadied mine when doubt took hold. And as days turned to weeks, that love became a thing both fragile and strong, as real as the boards of the cabin walls. Summer came early and hard that year, heat shimmering off the fields and turning dust to fine powder that clung to skin and lungs. The children grew brown with sun, their hair bleached lighter at the edges, and Rosalind took to tying her hair up under a wide-brimmed hat Ryland had fashioned from straw. I watched her sometimes from a distance, bending to pull weeds from the garden rows, her skirts brushing the new leaves, sweat darkening the cloth at her back, and I felt, more keenly than ever, the weight and wonder of what we had built together. The land taught us its own lessons, harsh but fair. One afternoon, a sudden storm rose from the west, driving rain so hard it flattened the young barley and sent us scrambling to save what we could. We worked side by side, mud sucking at our boots, the sky black as iron above us. And when it passed, leaving ruin and broken stalks behind, we stood in silence, drenched and bone-tired, and began again without a word. Later that night, when the children had fallen asleep, Rosalind and I sat at the table, our hands still stained with dirt and rain. I watched the lamplight flicker across her face, traced the curve of her cheek with my gaze, and felt something unspoken settle between us, a shared understanding that loss would come again and again, but so too would the strength to start over. We bought more land, that Samara narrow strip along the creek, enough to plant corn come spring. It cost dear, and for a time I lay awake worrying over the debt. But Rosalind's calm steadied me. She kept the accounts in the ledger she'd brought from her girlhood home, her figures neat and sure. Watching her bend over the pages by lamplight, I saw not the woman who had been left behind, but a partner, someone who carried the weight beside me, who dreamed the same stubborn, quiet dreams. The children grew into their own places in that dream. Ryland took to following me from dawn till dusk, his questions quiet but insistent. How to sharpen a blade, how deep to set a fence post, how to judge a horse's gait by the shift of its shoulders. Ruthie, younger and softer in her ways, stayed closer to Rosalind, learning stitches and songs I had never heard, her small voice rising and falling in time with the hum of the wheel. At night, the cabin felt too small for all we carried, and yet it held us just the same. We slept close, the warmth of shared breath and bodies pressing back the darkness. And in the hush before sleep claimed me, I would look to the rafters and think of what it meant to belong to a place, to a family, to a love that had asked nothing at first and yet had become everything. By late summer, the fields stood tall and green, promise heavy on each stem. We spoke of building another room to give Ryland and Ruthie their own space, and of planting fruit trees along the western fence line. Rosalind began saving scraps of cloth for quilts she planned to make come winter, her hands always busy, her mind turned toward a future neither of us had dared to picture in those first raw days. And yet, for all the planning and the quiet joy, shadows lingered at the edge of thought, memories of what loss had taught us, reminders that nothing in this world was promised. But those shadows did not weigh as heavily as before. We had each other now, and in that bond lay a strength that even the hardest winter could not easily break. One evening, near harvest time, I stood at the field's edge, the sun setting fire to the horizon, and felt a deep, bone-deep gratitude for the path that had led me here, the failures and losses that had brought me to Clearwater, to Rosalind, to these two children who had come to call me theirs. And in that moment, I understood something simple and true, that what we build together day by day holds more weight than anything the past could ever claim. The land had tested us, the seasons had shaped us, and yet here we stood, still standing, still together. And as I turned back toward the cabin, where lamplight glowed warm behind the shutters, I knew that whatever lay ahead, be it storm or drought, loss or joy, we would meet it not as four lost souls, but as one family, forged in hardship and held by love. Harvest came upon us like a slow dawn, first hinted in the gold along the edges of the barley, then blazing full in fields heavy with grain. Those were long days and longer nights, sweat soaking through shirts, arms sore from swinging scythes, and boots caked with dust, so thick it seemed part of the leather. Yet there was something almost holy in that exhaustion, a quiet pride that came from seeing what our hands had brought from stubborn earth. Ryland worked at my side, his face grown leaner with the work, and I watched him change in those weeks. The boy who had first stood by our barn with soot on his face and Ruthie clinging to his leg had given way to someone surer, shoulders squaring each morning against the weight of what needed doing. Sometimes, when the light caught his face just so, I saw a glimpse of the man he might yet become, strong in a way that had nothing to do with muscle, shaped more by kindness than by circumstance. Ruthie too found her place. She gathered kindling and herbs, ran barefoot through rows of drying grain, and her laughter high and sudden seemed to lift the heaviness from our backs. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the ridge and the fields lay quiet, she would sit beside Rosalind, learning to patch worn trousers or hem a torn skirt, and I would watch them, the rhythm of their hands steady as breath, and think that whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together. Rosalind herself became the heart of that harvest. She rose before first light, hands already busy kneading dough or setting water to boil. By midday, her face shone with sweat, hair pulled back in a way that framed the quiet strength of her jaw. Yet it was in the small, unseen moments that I glimpsed her truest self. The way she paused to wipe Ruthie's brow, or laid a hand on Ryland's shoulder when his strength flagged, or looked my way across the fields. A look that said without words, "I see you, I'm still here." At night we gathered on the porch, lantern light flickering over tired faces. Rosalind would mend by lamplight, Ruthie curled at her side, Ryland whittling small shapes from scrap wood, and I would sit back, the ache in my bones softened by the sight of them. The wind carried the scent of cut grain and cooling earth, and for a few quiet minutes each night the world felt gentle. Yet harvest was not without its tests. Late one afternoon, clouds gathered fast over the western ridge at Hunda, rolling low, the air thick with the scent of rain and something sharper like burnt iron. We raced to pull in what we could, but the storm came on too quick. Sheets of rain lashed the fields, wind bending the barley near flat, and lightning split the sky so close the air burned in my chest. I remember Rosalind's face in that moment, set and calm, even as she ushered Ruthie into the cabin, her dress soaked through and hair clinging dark to her neck. Ryland and I stayed outside, securing what grain we could under canvas, our hands raw and stinging with cold rain. When at last we stumbled inside, dripping and bone-tired, Rosalind pressed dry cloths into our hands, her eyes saying what words could not. "You came back. You're safe." We lost more than we saved that day. In the ledger that night, Rosalind noted the damage with steady script, lips pressed tight. But when I looked closer, I saw that beneath the columns of figures and loss, she had written 4 small words. "We still have us." And so we did. Winter announced itself not with a sudden frost, but with a slow, creeping chill that settled into the bones of the land. Leaves turned gold, then brown, then let go all at once, the bare branches scratching against gray skies. We hauled wood from the ridge, stacking it high under the lean-to. Rosalind salted and smoked what meat we could spare, jars of beans and dried apples lining the shelves in neat rows. The cabin smelled of smoke and cinnamon, of earth and wool, of life pressed close against the coming cold. The nights grew longer, shadows deepening early across the floorboards. Yet where once silence had felt heavy, now it felt Sharita quiet. We entered together rather than fled from. Rosalind sat at her mending. Ryland read aloud from an old almanac, stumbling sometimes over the long words. Ruthie dozed against my side, her small hand curling into my sleeve. And I listened, the sound of Ryland's voice mingling with the soft rasp of Rosalind's needle through cloth, and felt something settle in my chest, something like belonging, something like peace. One evening, snow began to fall first, just a scatter of flakes, then thicker, until the world outside lay muffled under white. I stepped out onto the porch, boots sinking into fresh drifts, and breathed in the sharp, cold air. The fields lay hidden now, the fence lines buried, but I knew them by heart. Each post we'd sunk, each row we'd planted, each stone turned by hand. Behind me, lamplight spilled from the window, framing Rosalind as she watched me, Ruthie leaning sleep-heavy against her hip. In that moment, the weight of the past years, the losses, the hunger, the nights spent doubting felt somehow lighter, not gone, never gone, but carried together now, shared among us in a way that made it bearable. I had not come to this ridge to find family, yet here they stood, waiting behind that door. A woman who had taught me love could be quiet and lasting. A boy who had taken to calling me Pa without ceremony. A girl whose laughter had mended parts of me I hadn't known were broken. Winter tested us, as it always did. Drifts rose high against the cabin walls. Winds howled through the cracks, no matter how we patched them. Ryland fell ill for a weak fever, bright in his cheeks, breath ragged in the dark hours. Rosalind sat at his side near constant, Ruthie clinging to her skirts, while I kept the fire fed, splitting logs until my hands bled. And when at last the fever broke, leaving Ryland pale but smiling, I stepped outside into the snow-heavy dawn and wept where no one could see. Yet for all winter took, it also gave. Long nights by the hearth drew us closer, Ruthie tracing letters in the ash on the hearthstone, Ryland carving figures of horses and birds from scraps of wood, Rosalind humming songs I did not know the words to, yet felt all the same. And sometimes, in the hush after the children slept, she would lay her head against my chest, and we would speak of things we dared not say by daylight, of orchards yet to plant, of a room we might add come spring, of years that might stretch ahead of us, built day by careful day. By late winter, we spoke of more land again, a small parcel south of the creek, offered cheap by a neighbor heading east. The price was dear, but Rosalind's voice, when she said let's, held a certainty that steadied me. And so we planned, tracing boundary lines by lamplight, the children listening wide-eyed to talk of orchards and new fences, of rows of corn and berry brambles. Dreams, perhaps, but ours all the same. When the first thaw came, it came slow. Icicles dripping from the eaves, snow sinking into mud that clung thick to boots. We walked the fields together, Roslyn and I, boots sinking deep, marking where new posts must go, where soil felt richest underfoot. Her hand brushed mine as we walked, the touch small and quick, yet it felt like promise itself. And standing there, in the wet, thawing earth, I understood. What we were building could never truly be measured in bushels or coin or acres. It was measured instead in the quiet trust that had grown between us, in the laughter of children who had once known only loss, in the shared resolve to keep trying, even when the world said stop. That night, back in the warmth of the cabin, I watched Roslyn's face in the lamplight, the soft lines drawn by worry and hope alike, and felt a gratitude so fierce it near hurt. I'd come here with nothing but dust in my coat and regret on my back. Yet somehow, through stubbornness, grace, and the simple, stubborn act of staying, we had built something that felt like home, and those springs still lay beyond the ice-clogged creek and the mud-slick fields. It waited for us, and this time we would walk toward it together. Spring returned to us, not all at once, but in shy promises. The first crocus breaking through thaw-softened earth, the creek running faster, louder with melt, and the scent of wet pine carried on morning wind. It came with mud that clung thick to boots and wagon wheels alike, but to us it smelled like a second chance, a promise, whispered in the language of green shoots and slow, sure thaw. Roslyn moved through those days with a quiet determination, eyes scanning fence lines for winter damage, hands mending what snow and ice had undone. She planned the new parcel south of the creek, as though she'd carried its map inside her heart all winter. Sometimes I'd watch her stand at the edge of the field, skirts brushing damp grass, her brow drawn in thought, and in those moments, I saw in her not just the woman who had come to my door, thin and wary, but the one who had chosen to stay, to build. We drove posts into the wet ground, boots sinking ankle-deep in mud. Ryland worked alongside me, muscles leaner from the last harvest, hands learning to hold a hammer true. Ruthie toted small stones in her apron, cheeks pink with effort and pride alike. And always, Roslyn was there, sometimes guiding, sometimes simply standing close enough that I could feel the quiet steadiness of her presence. In the evenings, we traced plans by lamplight. Rows of beans here, an orchard there, a shed by the fence line. Roslyn's voice, low and certain, guided the pencil across yellowed paper, marking lines where none had yet been cut. And in the flicker of lantern light, I saw how her eyes held both worry and hope, in equal measure, a woman who knew what could be lost, yet dared to plan all the same. By late spring, the land had begun to dry under warmer winds. We planted in earnest, seeds pressed into dark soil, each buried hope of green to come. Ruthie skipped between rows, dropping kernels of corn with careful hands. Ryland hoisted the water pail, sweat slick on his brow, his back straight despite the weight. And Roslyn's laughter, still rare enough to startle Morose above the rustle of young leaves and the quiet groan of leather harness. Some nights, after the children slept, she'd sit with me on the porch, shawl around her shoulders, eyes following the moon as it rose over the ridge. The hush between us then felt different than the silence we'd once Sharita peace-earned rather than settled for. Sometimes I'd catch her gaze lingering on the field beyond the fence, as if seeing not what was, but what might yet come. Vines heavy with fruit, an orchard in bloom, laughter rising from a place that had known only wind and snow. One evening, as dusk softened the world into shapes of blue and gray, Roslyn spoke of her past words, offered slow, like something precious and breakable. She told me of a childhood spent in a town where her family's name had carried more weight than warmth, of parents taken too soon by fever, of a man she had once almost wed, who'd chosen the promise of gold in California over her quiet steadiness. Her voice held no blame, only the soft ache of old wounds pressed by memory. And as she spoke, I felt my own story shift. The years I'd spent wandering from town to town, calloused by work and silence, the father buried under rock and regret, the places I'd left before they could ask me to stay. In her telling, I saw our loneliness as matching puzzle pieces shaped by different sorrows, but meant to fit together all the same. We did not speak of love that night, not in words, but in the hush after her voice fell quiet, I reached for her hand, rough with work and warmth alike, and she let her fingers lace with mine. And in that simple gesture, more true than any vow, I heard what neither of us needed to say aloud. As summer edged closer, the land greened under our hands. Beans climbed stakes set by Ryland's careful hammer. Corn reached knee-high, leaves sharp and shining in morning sun. The orchard showed its first stubborn blossoms small, white petals clinging to branches we'd planted barely a season past. Ruthie watched them with wide eyes, asking each day if fruit would come by fall. The children grew in ways I had not expected. Ryland, once wary and guarded, laughed more easily now, his voice breaking into a man's pitch at odd moments. I saw the boy he'd been giving way to the man he might yet become, patient, quick to shoulder what weight he could. And Ruthie, still small, learned to read her name traced in the dust. Her joy at each letter a reminder that growing was as much about spirit as it was about height. At night, the cabin felt different too. Where once its walls had seemed to hold back only wind and loneliness, now they held warmth. Laughter echoing against rough-hewn boards, the quiet scrape of spoon against pot, Rosalind's hum drifting over the hush of the children's breath. I found myself lingering longer by the hearth, reluctant to step away from the circle we had built together. Late one evening, as I finished patching a broken hinge on the barn door, Rosalind appeared at my side, candle held high, her face half lit and half shadowed. "Come see," she said, voice low, eyes bright, with something between wonder and pride. She led me to the small orchard. Moonlight silvered the leaves, and there among the branches hung the first hard green knots of fruitany, stubborn proofs of what we had planted together. And standing there, under a sky wide enough to swallow regret and hope alike, I felt a quiet joy settle deep into my bones. We stood silent, the only sounds the rustle of wind through young branches and the soft crackle of distant leaves. In that stillness, I realized, what we were growing mattered less than the simple fact we were growing it together. The orchard, the fields, the children, all these things were pieces of something larger, something neither of us had dared name until now. As midsummer neared, the work grew harder. Sun beat down fierce and unrelenting, sweat drying into salt on our necks and arms. Fences needed mending, weeds pulled by stubborn roots, barrels hauled to the creek and back to keep the young corn from withering. Yet even in the exhaustion, I felt a strength that came not from muscle alone, but from knowing I no longer worked for survival alone, but for something that could outlast me. In the rare, quiet moments, Rosalind and I spoke of what might come next. A second room for the cabin, perhaps a space where Ryland might one day sleep under his own roof, or Ruthie could keep her dolls and books away from the kitchen's clatter. Or maybe more land west of the ridge, soil said to be rich and dark, where we could plant grains to trade come autumn. Sometimes I caught myself dreaming farther still, of grandchildren underfoot, of evenings by a larger hearth, of Rosalind's hair turned silver in the same soft lamplight that now caught its copper strands. And though the thought scared me, this hope I'd never dared before I let it stay. Then came the day Ryland asked if he could call me Pa outright. No ceremony, no preamble, just words offered in the hush before dawn, as we stood by the corral, steam rising from the horses' flanks. My throat tightened too much to speak at first, but when I managed to nod, the relief in his shoulders spoke all the words we needed. And later, when I told Rosalind, she smiled a smile small and soft, but bright enough to light the whole of that morning. The summer wore on, harvest approached again, the fields growing heavy with promise. And each morning, As I stepped onto the porch, boots sinking into dust turned gold by dawn, I found myself grateful in ways I could not have named before. For the quiet breathing of children asleep behind rough-hewn walls, for Rosalind's steady presence at my side, for the chance to build, not just survive. I had once thought love must arrive sudden and consuming a wildfire to burn away loneliness, but here, in the quiet bend of Rosalind's smile, in Ryland's steady hammer, in Ruthie's laughter carried on warm wind, I saw love for what it truly was, slow as spring thaw, stubborn as roots gripping stone, gentle as rain on dry earth, and stronger, perhaps, than either of us had ever dared to hope. And as the first heads of grain bowed heavy under summer's weight, I knew that whatever storms might come in, they surely would, we had built something that could stand against them. A life planted deep, tended daily, and grown, at last, together. Autumn didn't come with sudden frost or a single gust of cold wind. It arrived by degrees, the morning air turning sharp enough to bite, the shadows lengthening earlier each evening, the first leaves along the creek shifting from summer green to gold edged with rust. And in that slow turning, I felt the measure of what we had built not in months, but in steady days stacked like cordwood against the coming cold. The fields we had planted stood ripe, oats heavy on the stalk, corn tasseling tall. We worked from first light to last, Ryland swinging the scythe in clean arcs that spoke of muscle earned, Ruthie trailing behind with her small basket, gathering what fell too low for larger hands to reach. Rosalind moved through the rows with quiet authority, eyes measuring what should be cut first, what could wait. Watching her then, hair braided tight against the wind, I saw not the woman I had once met beside a chapel's door, but the heart of this land steady, sure and stubborn enough to coax life from stubborn soil. At night, we hauled the harvest into the barn, grain pouring in dusty rivers from sack to bin. The air inside smelled sweet and sharp, the promise of bread and barter, of a winter less lean than the last. Afterward, by lamplight, Rosalind traced our ledger with her fingertip, calculating what might be set aside, what might be traded come frost. And each time her gaze lifted to meet mine across the table, I felt the quiet, wordless agreement that had grown between us. This was ours, built by hand day on day, seed by seed. When the last sheaf was stacked, the land seemed to exhale around us. The fields lay shorn, stubble catching morning dew like frost, and the days turned cooler still. Ryland patched the chicken coop against winter foxes. Ruthie, legs swinging from the porch rail, helped Rosalind mend clothes worn thin by work and weather. And me, I cut new fence rails, hands stiff from old breaks but stubborn as ever, each strike of the mallet echoing across ground that had learned our names. One late afternoon, clouds rolled thick over the ridge, the air tasting of rain. We gathered on the porch to watch the first drops darken dry earth, Ruthie leaning against Rosalind's hip, Ryland silent beside me. The rain came slow, then faster, until it drummed the roof in a song that felt half warning, half blessing. In that hush broken only by rain, I found myself thinking how strange it was to love a place so fiercely not for what it promised, but for what it had already given. Later that night, when the storm had passed, Rosalind spoke of spring plans. The orchard will need pruning, and maybe we could set a new row of beans by the creek soils richer there. Her voice was soft, but her eyes were bright, reflecting lamplight and something deeper still. And as I listened, I realized how her hope had become my compass, each plan she whispered into the hush marking a trail I had come to trust more than any map. As days shortened, we turned to winter work. Ryland and I hauled logs down from the ridge, sweat steaming off our backs in the chill. Ruthie helped Rosalind render tallow, small hands steady despite the heat of the pot. At dusk, smoke curled from the chimney in a thin white ribbon, and the smell of cornbread mixed with wood smoke felt like the surest proof of home I had ever known. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Rosalind brought out a small cloth bundle she'd kept hidden in the bottom of the trunk. Inside lay scraps of ribbon, bits of lace, and a faded letter folded so many times the creases had worn the words thin. She didn't read it aloud, but her fingers traced each line as if they remembered every word. And then, without looking at me, she set it on the fire. The paper curled black, words dissolving into smoke. When the last ember dimmed, she lifted her gaze to mine, and though she did not speak, I understood. Some ghosts could only be buried by our own hand. The first frost came overnight, silvering the world by dawn. Ruthie pressed her palm to the window, breath clouding glass, marveling at how the grass had turned to crystal filigree. Ryland hauled the last of the squash into the root cellar, his shoulders square, a boy's limbs bearing a man's weight. And Rosalind, standing beside me on the porch, wrapped her shawl tighter and simply said, "We're ready." Ready. I had never known what that felt like before. All my life had been a string of camps struck at dawn, of doors left before they could close behind me. But now, with wood stacked high, food laid by, and a fire banked against the coming dark, I felt it for the first time. The quiet certainty that whatever winter brought, we would meet it together. As snow fell, life shifted inward. The cabin became a world unto itself, walls holding warmth and laughter, the scratch of pen on ledger, the hiss of dough frying in the skillet. Ryland carved small toys for Ruthie from scrap wood. She painted them with berry dye until her fingers stained red. In the evenings, we gathered near the hearth, Rosalind's voice weaving stories of years before the children could remember, tales of rivers crossed, of cabins built from nothing, of gardens coaxed from stubborn soil. And though the words were hers, the shape of them belonged to all of us, a family drawn together not by blood but by choice, and made stronger by every trial weathered side by side. Sometimes when wind howled against the shutters, I lay awake, Rosalind's breath warm against my shoulder, and thought of the road that had brought us here. The man I had been, the one who rode into Clearwater with nothing but a coat, and a need to keep moving, felt distant, yet not gone. I carried him still, the same way I carried the memory of my father's calloused hands, the smell of coal dust, the ache of loss. But beside him, I carried something else, the memory of Ruthie's laugh, the sound of Ryland's hammer finding its mark, the warmth of Rosalind's hand reaching for mine without needing to ask. And in those moments I understood. It wasn't that the past was forgotten. It was that at last it had somewhere to rest. Midwinter brought a deep, hard freeze. Creek iced over thick enough to walk across. Fences rhymed in white each dawn. Yet even then, life kept its rhythm. Ryland woke before first light to check the livestock. Ruthie learned to knead dough with Rosalind's gentle guidance. I mended what the cold had cracked, hinges stiffened by frost, boards split by the weight of snow. And always, at day's end, the four of us gathered by the fire, a quiet constellation drawn close against the cold. One evening, as snow sifted down like sifted flour, Rosalind spoke of spring again. "When thaw comes, I want to plant wildflowers around the orchard. Something for the bees." Her voice held no doubt, only the quiet conviction of someone who had survived enough winters to know that spring always comes 7, if not on the day you first hope. Listening, I found my heart answering hers, not with grand words, but with a simple vow, to keep building, to keep tending, to keep staying even when the road ahead felt uncertain, for in her hope I saw the shape of my own. Toward late winter, Ryland finished carving a small wooden box oak, smoothed by patient hands, a simple design. He gave it to Rosalind without ceremony. Inside, she kept small treasures, a ribbon Ruthie had worn on her birthday, a button from Ryland's first coat, a lock of hair snipped from Ruthie when she was still small enough to sleep in a basket by the hearth. Watching her place each piece inside, I understood that love sometimes lives not in grand gestures, but in the small, quiet keeping of memory. And as snow began to melt along the creek, water running dark and cold between banks still crusted with ice, I felt it again. That slow, stubborn thaw that comes not from sun alone, but from the warmth we give each other hand to hand, day to day, season to season, When spring finally broke the land free, it came as more than just warmth. It came as proof of what we had built. Buds greening the orchard, shoots breaking dark earth, children's laughter echoing across fields that had once held only wind. And in that new light, I saw our story not as an end but as a beginning we had planted, tended, and grown not in the soil alone, but in each other. By the time the last snow melted into the thirsty earth, the creek ran loud enough to hear from the porch. The land shook off winter like an old coat, and each morning the sun rose earlier, spilling gold across fields that had slept for months. And in that first true warmth, we began again. Spring, I had learned, was never gentle. It came roaring in, water rising fast enough to threaten fence lines, mud swallowing wagon wheels to the axle, wind tearing at new roofs we had patched only weeks before. But there was life in that violent sea of promise, that cold would not hold sway forever. And so we met it with calloused hands and stubborn hearts. Rosalind walked the orchard at dawn, her shadow long across wet grass, studying each branch for frostbite, for broken limbs. Ruthie trailed behind, apron pockets stuffed with stones she called her treasures, singing under her breath. Ryland took to the fields with a new quiet confidence. He knew the lines of the land now, the way low spots would flood first, where rocks hid just beneath the soil waiting to break a blade. And me? I repaired what winter had broken, the north fence that leaned under snowdrifts, the chicken coop roof that leaked during thaw. My hands bore new scars layered over old ones, but each cut felt earned the price gladly paid for something that felt more permanent than anything I had ever known. One morning, I stood at the edge of our field, mud clinging to my boots, watching Rosalind scatter seed by careful handfuls. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if each kernel carried hope too fragile to drop careless. And I realized then that planting had become something different to me. Not just a wager against hunger, but a declaration that we planned to stay, to see these seeds rise into stalks and feed the children whose laughter filled the house behind us. Evenings softened in spring. After supper, we sat on the porch, Ryland carving small animals from pine, Ruthie braiding flowers into her hair, Rosalind leaning against the post with a shawl around her shoulders. The air smelled of thawed earth and wood smoke, and sometimes, when the wind calmed, I thought I could almost hear the land breathing. Rosalind began speaking more of the past, but only in pieces, as if testing whether old wounds had finally healed enough to show. She told of nights spent in a cold room with no fire, of waiting for footsteps that never came home, of a dress she wore until it frayed at the hem, hoping someone might see her worth in its careful stitching. And as I listened, I understood that survival had taught her silence, but it had never taken her hope. "I used to think," she said one dusk, voice barely louder than the creek beyond, "that if I could just work hard enough, I'd earn a place beside someone. But it isn't about earning, is it?" I shook my head. "It's about choosing and staying." She nodded, eyes soft, and in that moment, we shared a truth deeper than any vow. Spring brought other changes too. Ryland, now nearly shoulder-high to me, spoke of wanting his own field, a plot of ground to call his. Ruthie asked to help Rosalind more, her small fingers learning to tie knots and mend torn seams. And together, we walked the edge of the new parcel we had bought last autumn, planting rows of corn, imagining fruit trees blooming white against the ridge. Work made the days blur, but not forgettable. Each sunrise found us side by side, tools in hand, and each sunset left us bone-tired but grateful. In the hush before sleep, lying beside Rosalind, I sometimes thought back to that first day in Clearwater, dust on my coat, a question on my lips, and a woman who met my gaze without flinching. And I thanked whatever twist of road had brought us both, broken as we were, to the same small chapel. As fields greened, the orchard bloomed. White blossoms clung to dark branches, fragile and stubborn, and bees traced slow, golden paths between them. Ruthie danced beneath falling petals, calling them summer snow. Ryland learned to guide the plow with steady hands, sweat darkening his shirt, and each pass left the earth turned fresh, ready for seed. One afternoon, as clouds gathered over the ridge, Rosalind called to me from the porch, a folded paper in her hand. "A letter," she said, voice careful. "From town." I took it, the parchment thin and travel-worn. Inside, a few lines from a cousin she had not seen in years, asking if she still meant to come east, offering a place to stay. Rosalind watched my face as I read, her eyes steady but shadowed. "Do you want to go?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't belong there anymore." Her voice held no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that felt heavier than any promise. "I belong here." We burned the letter that evening, flame curling the words into ash that drifted across the yard. And though neither of us spoke of it again, I knew what it meant. She had chosen not just this land, but User home, our shared scars, our slow-built hope. Summer came early, heat settling over fields still damp from spring rain. The creek shrank to a quicksilver ribbon, banks cracked and dry. We rose before dawn to haul water, Ruthie carrying a small pail too big for her hands but refusing help. Ryland sweated through days in the fields, and Rosalind's cheeks flushed from sun and labor. But each evening, as we gathered around the rough-hewn table, laughter returned thin at first, then steady, as stubborn as the crops pushing up through dry earth. One night, a storm rolled down from the north. Lightning split the sky, thunder shaking the walls until Ruthie woke crying. Rosalind lifted her from her pallet, rocking gently, humming an old tune that made the child's sobs quiet. Ryland sat near me on the floor, wide-eyed but silent, and I felt the weight of years. The boy I had met, thin and soot, streaked, now taller, steadier, carrying his own strength. When the storm passed, Rosalind settled Ruthie back to sleep, her hand resting on the girl's back until breath evened out. And then, in the hush that followed, she came to sit beside me by the dying fire. "I used to be afraid of thunder," she said, voice soft as rain on the roof. "Not anymore. I've lived through worse," she answered, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Summer deepened. We built a new lean-to against the barn, shade for the livestock. Ryland learned to mend harness leather. Ruthie gathered wild herbs with Rosalind, small hands brushing sage and mint. Evenings found us on the porch, watching heat lightning dance along distant hills, too far to hear but close enough to remind us how small we were against the sky. And yet, even in that smallness, we felt strong, not because the world grew kinder, but because we had learned to face it together. One hot dusk, Rosalind stood beside me near the orchard, sun sinking behind the ridge. Her hair caught the last light, haloed gold. "I used to count days," she murmured. "How long until winter? How long since I left? How long I'd stay? And now? Now I count seasons and plans." I didn't answer, but I reached for her hand, fingers calloused, warm and real. As harvest neared, fields stood tall, heavy with promise. Ryland walked the rows with me, measuring grain between thumb and palm the way I had shown him. Ruthie carried baskets, barefoot and dusty, hair tied back with a scrap of faded ribbon Rosalind had saved from years before. In those days I saw our past, and every furrow turned, every seed sown. Pain and loss, yes, but also choice, stubborn and deliberate, written in sweat and soil. And I knew, whatever storms still waited, whatever winters came, we would meet them. Together. That night, sitting by the fire, I watched Rosalind mend a tear in Ruthie's dress. Her needle moved steady, thread bright against faded cloth. Ryland dozed beside the hearth, Ruthie curled against his shoulder. And in that quiet, I understood, love isn't loud. It's the patient stitch, the shared burden, the hand that stays even when the road turns hard. Outside, the wind carried the promise of rain. Inside, we had warmth, laughter, and something stronger than any vow. We had us. Autumn arrived not as an abrupt guest, but as a slow-breathing presence that settled into every corner of our land. The morning sharpened first, breath turning to mist at the barn door, and then came the hush that always followed harvest. Fields stripped bare, earth resting after months of yielding. I'd learned to listen to that silence, see not as emptiness, but as a promise of what we'd planted and what we might yet plant. Ryland had grown taller through the summer, shoulders broadening, hands rough from fence work and harness repair. Ruthie had lost the soft roundness of her youngest years. Her legs carried her faster, her questions came sharper. And Rosalind, sometimes I'd catch her standing at the edge of the orchard, a faint crease between her brows, as though she was counting not what was there, but what might come next. We had built so much since the day we signed that paper in the chapel. New fences, 2 more rooms to hold the children as they grew, a loft above the barn to keep winter hay dry. But more than timber and nails, we had built habits. Ruthie's laughter drifting through morning chores, Ryland's quiet nod when I asked him to check the far gate, Rosalind's humming in the twilight as she stitched by lamplight. The shape of our days had become the shape of our belonging. Yet as leaves turned gold and firelit evenings grew longer, something restless stirred in me. I would wake before dawn, lie beside Rosalind, listening to her steady breath, and think of the ridges beyond our land, places I hadn't seen, valleys where our name meant nothing. The pull wasn't toward leaving, but toward stretching what we had built into something wider, something that might outlast even us. One night, as wind rattled the shutters, I told her, "There's land past the creek," I said, voice low so as not to wake the children. "Untouched, rich soil, so they say." She turned from her sewing, needle paused mid-stitch. "And you'd claim it?" "I'd clear it, fence it, plant fruit trees. It would be ours, something for Ryland to carry forward." For a moment, her gaze drifted past me, as though seeing a different horizon than I did. Then she met my eyes and nodded once. "Then let's see it when the snow clears." In spring we crossed the creek at dawn, boots sinking into frost-soft earth, mist curling around us. The land lay quiet, a hidden hollow where wild grass bent under dew and rabbit tracks crisscrossed mud near the bank. Rosalind ran her hand through the grass, lifted it to show the dark, rich soil clinging to her fingers. "It could hold roots," she said, almost to herself. That day, we marked lines in the earth with nothing more than a stick and hope. Ruthie followed, placing wildflowers at each corner, and Ryland carried posts 2 at a time, sweat dampening his collar even in the chill. By sundown, the outlines of what could be stood plain as fence rails in my mind. Winter returned before we could do more. Snow drifted higher than the porch rails. Wind howled through the cracks, and every morning began with the bite of cold water at the wash basin. But even in those months, planning kept us warm. Sketches on scrap paper by lamplight, whispered lists of seed and timber, Ruthie's careful drawings of what the orchard might look like come bloom. At night, as the fire died to embers, Rosalind and I lay quiet, our breath soft in the dark. Sometimes she spoke of the years before me, her voice flat but steady. Rooms that smelled of sickness, footsteps that never returned, days when dawn brought no relief. I listened not to judge the past, but to honor the road that had led her to this bed, this roof, this life beside me. And slowly, the telling became easier. Silence no longer meant fear, but rest. As snow softened to mud, Ryland turned 16. We marked the day with cornbread baked sweet with molasses, and a quilt Rosalind had spent the winter piecing from cloth too worn for shirts. When he laid it across his bed that night, he traced each square with his fingers, as though counting every stitch of care she had poured into it. And though he spoke little, his eyes, when they met mine across the table, said all that words could not. Spring work began again. Fence mending, seed sowing, roof patching where snow had bowed the beams. But this year, Ryland took the plow's handles himself, leaning into the traces, guiding the blade through stubborn earth. Ruthie carried seed in her apron, scattering careful handfuls, while Rosalind walked the row beside her, head bent close, voice low and patient. Watching them, I understood something simple. Love had become our daily labor, plain and sturdy as the tools in my hands. No grand gestures, no declarations shouted across fields, only the quiet vow renewed each dawn to keep building, keep tending, keep choosing each other. By midsummer, the new parcel beyond the creek stood fenced, corners braced with stone we hauled from the ridge. We planted apple saplings, their roots wrapped in damp burlap, branches thin and hopeful. Ruthie named each tree, whispering promises as she pressed soil around trunks. Ryland carved a sign from scrap oak, burned the letters with care. Ellis Orchard. He hung it on the gate himself, shoulders set, as if anchoring the name to the land. Evenings stretched long in summer light. We'd sit on the porch, sweat drying on skin still warm from the day, and watch fireflies spark in the grass. Rosalind often hummed tunes she'd brought from before, a language of melody that needed no words. Sometimes Ruthie joined, her small voice weaving through the melody, and Ryland tapped a quiet rhythm on the porch rail. And me, I listened, heart steady, grateful. But not every day was soft. Drought crisped the lower fields, and more than once we lost a hen to foxes bold enough to test the yard fence. One storm dropped hail that battered leaves and dented fruit barely formed. Ryland cursed under his breath, fists clenched, and I laid a hand on his shoulder. "This land owes us nothing," I reminded him. "But we keep asking, and most days it answers." That night he sat long by the fire, carving silent shapes from pine. When I rose to bank the coals, I saw he had shaped a small bird, wings spread as if caught mid-flight. He set it on the mantel without a word, and Rosalind later traced its curves with her fingertip, eyes soft. Late that summer, Rosalind found Ruthie near the creek bank, dress soaked, in tears streaking mud across her cheeks. "I lost it," Ruthie sobbed, hands empty. "The ribbon. The one Rosalind had given her seasons ago. Faded blue, frayed at the edge." Rosalind knelt in the mud beside her, gathered her close, and whispered something only Ruthie heard. At supper, Ruthie's eyes were still red, but she sat quiet, her head resting against Rosalind's arm. After the meal, Rosalind took a spool of deep red thread, the same we had bought years back, and braided it into Ruthie's hair. "Sometimes," she said, loud enough for all of us, "what we make new holds more meaning than what we lose." Watching them, I thought of every piece of me I had left behind to stand here now, roads I'd walked away from, names that meant nothing beyond memory. And I saw in Ruthie's small, tear-stained face the same lesson that had taken me years to learn. Grief was not something to banish, but something to carry gently, so hands stayed free to build again. As autumn neared once more, the orchard bore its first handful of apples, small and tot but sweeter for the waiting. Ruthie carried the first in her palms to Rosalind, who wiped it clean on her apron and set it on the table like a trophy. Ryland smiled, the corners of his mouth betraying pride. He didn't speak. That evening, as wind rustled leaves already touched with gold, Rosalind stood beside me by the orchard gate. "Do you remember?" she asked, voice low. "When you first told me you wanted more than to survive?" "I do." Her hand brushed mine, fingers twining. "I think we've begun." In that moment, I saw not just what we had built, but what might yet grow. Trees rooted deeper each year, children stepping into their own strength, laughter that might echo long after we were gone. And for the first time, I truly believed the life we had sown together could stretch beyond the span of our years. The winter that followed was harsher than any I'd known, but somehow it also felt different. Not because the wind bit less, or the snow settled softer, those truths never changed in Montana, but because for the first time I faced that long season not as a solitary man hardened by loss, but as a part of something larger, something fragile and fierce enough to hold us all together. The cold drove us indoors earlier than usual. Nights stretched long and dark, a deep hush settling over the homestead. The fire was our hearth and heart. Rosalind's hands never stopped moving, mending clothes, sewing heavier blankets, preparing simple meals from stores carefully rationed. I watched her work, the lines of worry softened by a quiet determination I could never have guessed she carried beneath her calm exterior. Ryland and Ruthie grew restless, cooped up inside, their spirits tethered to the world beyond the frost-covered windows. But still, they found ways to laugh, to imagine summer fields and muddy creek banks. Ruthie carved small wooden animals from scraps, and Ryland, with a slow smile, showed her how to fashion traps from bent wire and twine. It was in those moments flickering shadows cast by the firelight that I saw the threads weaving us into a true family. The darkness pressed in one evening as a blizzard clawed at the cabin walls. The wind tore through the cracks with a ferocity that shook the windows. We huddled close, the children tucked between Rosalind and me, their breaths shallow in sleep. I kept the lantern lit, moving quietly to the stove to keep the fire fed. The world outside was a wild and hostile place, but inside I felt a fierce warmth, the kind that builds slowly, stitched from trust and shared history. I thought back to the day I first saw Rosalind standing alone by the chapel, how hollow her eyes had been, how broken and unwanted she seemed, how different that woman was from the one who now pressed her hand to mine in the dark, her fingers strong and sure. There was no grand ceremony in that moment, only the soft rhythm of our breathing and the steady pulse of belonging. Winter passed as all winters do, leaving behind a world washed clean and new. The thaw brought sap running in the trees and a scent of earth turning warm again. With the promise of spring, hope felt almost tangible. A breath held steady between us. Rosalind took to the garden with new energy, turning over the soil, planting early shoots with care. I worked on reinforcing the barn roof, the echoes of hammer against wood sounding louder in the quiet dawn. Ryland and Ruthie ran through fields still muddy and soft, their laughter ringing like bells. One afternoon, as I returned from the creek with a load of fresh water, I found Rosalind sitting beneath the old cottonwood tree, the children nearby chasing shadows. She looked up at me, eyes clear and bright. "We have come far," she said simply. I nodded, feeling the weight of all that had been carried between us: loss, hope, fear, and finally, love. The summer that followed was a test, as summers often are. The orchard bloomed bright with promise, but then late frosts and drought challenged us anew. Some days, the work felt endless, the land a stubborn adversary rather than a partner. Yet through it all, Rosalind's steady hands and quiet strength never faltered. She was the backbone of the homestead, and I, slowly, the pulse. Our bond deepened in the ordinary things, sharing the first sweet apple from the harvest, patching clothes together by candlelight, watching the children sleep safe and sound. I began to understand love, not as a fierce blaze, but as the slow, sure fire that warms through the longest winters. There were moments rare and precious when Rosalind would look at me with something like wonder, as if seeing the man I had become beside her. And sometimes, when she thought I wasn't watching, a soft smile would lift her lips, a silent promise that we had found our place in the world. Ryland grew into his role as protector and helper, steady and sure-footed. Ruthie blossomed under Rosalind's care, a bright spark of laughter and curiosity. Together, they were the living proof of a future neither Rosalind nor I could have imagined when we first came together, two broken souls seeking refuge. One evening in late August, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire, Rosalind stood on the porch, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Do you remember the day we first married?" she asked, voice soft. I smiled, thinking of that dusty chapel, the quiet promise between us. "I do." She turned to face me fully, then eyes shimmering with tears. "We didn't start with love, just two people trying not to be alone." I squeezed her hand gently, but we found more than that. A breeze stirred the tall grass around us, carrying the scent of ripening fruit and earth. I pulled her close, my heart steady and full. "We built something real," I said. "Not just survival, but a home." Rosalind rested her head on my chest, and I could hear the steady beat of her heart. "That's everything," she whispered. As stars emerged, scattered like embers across the sky, I felt a peace I'd never known before. The children slept inside, safe and warm. The land stretched out around us, holding all the stories of hardship and hope. We had come so far from the lonely man and woman who met by chance in a quiet Montana town. We had become family, stronger together, bound by the quiet love that grows not in moments but in years. And I knew without doubt that whatever trails lay ahead, we would face them side by side. The dawn broke cold and clear that morning, the sky painted in soft pastels that promised a day free from storms. I stood outside the cabin, boots planted firmly in the earth that had become my life, my home. Around me, the land stretched wide and wild, a testament to all we had endured and built. It wasn't just a place anymore, it was ours. Rosalind came out behind me, her steps quiet on the porch, her hands clasped as always, but somehow more relaxed this time. She didn't say a word we never needed to. The silence between us was full, like the land beneath our feet, steady and sure. I thought back, as I often did these days, to the first moment I saw her standing alone by the chapel. The woman everyone else had turned away from, broken by grief, abandoned, unwanted. I wasn't looking for a bride, certainly not one like her. Yet something about her kept pulling me in, like a thread through a tapestry, stitching together the loose ends of my own fractured life. We didn't start with love. We started with survival, with quiet acceptance, two souls adrift in a harsh world, desperate to find a place where they could be more than just shadows. And that place, that home, was something neither of us dared hope for at first. But slowly, through seasons of hardship and hope, it grew. I looked over at Rosalind, and for the first time, I truly saw her, not the hollow woman I'd met, but the fierce, gentle heart who had carried us all through the darkest winters and the driest summers. She was the thread that held everything together. She was family. The children stirred inside the cabin, Ruthie's small footsteps padding against the wooden floor, Ryland's quiet humming as he helped with chores. Their laughter and life were the music that made this land sing. I breathed in the crisp morning air, tasting the promise of tomorrow. Our story was one not written in grand gestures or fleeting passions, but in the quiet, steady moments that stitch a life together, in the shared meals, the mended clothes, the whispered dreams beneath the stars. I remembered the long nights by the fire, Rosalind's soft humming as she stitched blankets, the way her eyes would catch the lamplight just so. I remembered how her touch had slowly thawed the frost around my heart, how her presence had made this wild place feel like home. The homestead had grown, as had we. We had planted orchards that bloomed year after year, fenced fields that fed us through hard seasons, and built a house filled with love and laughter. But it was more than bricks and timber. It was the lives we nurtured, two children whose losses had become our gains, two hearts that had found their rhythm in the quiet wilderness. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth beneath my feet. I turned to Rosalind, a soft smile breaking across my weathered face. "We made it, didn't we?" I said, my voice rough but steady. She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We did." I took her hand in mine, the same hand that had once been so tentative and unsure, now strong and sure. "We built more than a life. We built us." She leaned into me, her head resting against my shoulder, and I held her close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against mine. In that moment, I knew the road ahead would still hold its trials. Winter would come again, the land would test us, but nothing could break what we had built, the family we had become. Because sometimes, the greatest love isn't found in grand gestures or fairy tales. It's found in the quiet persistence of two broken souls choosing to walk together through every hard trail. And as the wind whispered through the trees and the sun warmed the fields around us, I felt a peace deeper than any I'd ever known. We were no longer alone. We were home,